Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming back. Just a logistics announcement at the beginning, and maybe before we turn on those recording devices. A logistics announcement is just that we're going to try to go strong from now till 10:30, and then take a break for 30 minutes, so there's ample time to check out and get settled and whatever else, and then come back and go from 11 to noon for lunch to break off at the end of the day. So it's a simple day, but we'll take a 30-minute break today instead of sometimes. All right, one more push. This should be a fun one. When Faith Angle emerged in 1999 with people like Will Salatin and Mike Cromartie and Karen Tumblety and a lot of other people that you probably know, the thing emerged at the beginning, the sense was that there was a bit of a blind spot on religion. And at some level, that has gotten better. There are great stories that the late Mike Gerson used to tell about, Bush running for president as governor of Texas. He would say, I'm not going to talk about the speck in my opponent's eye when there might be a log in my own. And the New York Times reporter covering the story that day said, we think this has some version, some derivation of the old story about the pot calling the kettle black. Just sort of didn't get the reference at all. Or John Paul II, when his funeral took place, was laying in rest with a crozier, but the piece in the Times said it was a crow's ear. Didn't know the reference to the staff. And then there were these Carmelite nuns that the BBC talked about at the funeral, and that was spelled karma light, like Karma space Light. There were lots of examples of things sort of going bad. But a lot of that has gotten better with time, and I think Mike Cromartie gets a lot of credit for that, but also some of the innovative and creative thinkers in philanthropy at Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, at the Lilly Endowment, the John Templeton Foundation, the Templeton Religion Trust, Stand Together, Murdoch Trust, and others. And some of you in the room even have roles today that are subsidized in part by that innovation. Projects at NPR, projects at AP, projects at RNS. Blind spots can get better. But they also keep popping up. What about the way that a lot of us in the room and mainstream journalists in general view various initiatives tied to the Trump administration? At dinner last night, one of you asked how many Trump sympathizers, how many Trump supporters we've hosted at these forums since at least, I came along 2018, and I was trying to think through the list. And, if not full-on Trump advocates, how many scholars who have come through, clerics, have visited with journalists, have sort of been able to offer a clear window into the why of what's unfolded in this complex, polarizing last political decade. A few names do come to mind. Matthew Goodwin, who wrote the book National Populism. Who wrote White Shift? Eric Kaufman, Knox Thames on religious freedom, Sarah McCammon at NPR on sort of evangelical lines, evangelical rootedness, Tim Alberta, David Brooks, Trey Stevens, Luke Russert, Yuval Levin, Nadine Menza, Tevi Troy, Elliot Abrams, Bernard-Henri Levy, John C. Green, Christian Smith, Ed Stitzer, Andrew Walker, Yasha Monk, Ann Applebaum, Matt Kamink. If people weren't always sympathetic, if they weren't always sort of arguing for what the administration was describing, at least a lot of these scholars have peered clearly into the roots of Trumpism. And that's, we hope, an offering. But when the country's moving in directions that we don't like, the temptation is to stand apart, to move a bit further into advocacy journalism, even in reporting pieces, sometimes perhaps not even to fully see or to misconstrue the thing itself. And so this morning, we get to talk about MAHA, what it is, where it came from, and how, if at all, religion fits into the story. Is MAHA, thinking about it, Bobby Kennedy and Pete Hegseth and Sean Duffy doing chin-ups, push-ups? Is it a massive overhaul on vaccine expectations, rooted in discontent from MAGA evangelical friends like the people that Tim was describing yesterday, who don't want their churches closed because of COVID restrictions, sort of still feeling under siege from Washington. Is MAHA Casey Means up for Surgeon General, making her way through the confirmation hearings, pushing back with the core arguments of the thesis of her book, Good Energy? Is it gutting a lot of scientific research at NIH? Or is MAHA an effort to roll back and reform the trend of the last decade or so where, as I understand it from Mehmet Oz, where doctor pay has increased at about half the rate of GDP growth, but hospital revenue has increased at about 2x the rate of GDP growth, sort of a reform effort. For the people that we know who are at HHS and are a notch down from RFK Jr., and that's, I think, the critical group to understand for the initiative, MAHA seems to be partly and maybe substantially even about bureaucratic reform, about reforming SNAP benefits, about revamping CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, to make it affordable to sort of cover the costs of Medicaid and Medicare, and the spike that's accompanied and followed Obamacare enrollments that have escalated. If it's no longer about having the federal government pay for gender transitions, for people in prison. Remember that famous Kamala Harris ad? She's for they, them, I'm for you. What is MAHA? Is MAHA about pushing healthcare back to the states, balancing the ledger quite a bit differently than SNL talks about on their Ma Hospital skit that was perfectly timed for this gathering on Saturday night? At the Aspen Institute, our amazing health and society program director, Ruth Katz, is trying to be open. But she clearly and strongly believes in vaccines, and she's incredibly seen the incredible good that's come from federal investment in sustained scientific research at NIH, where she had a long career before coming over to Aspen. But yet she still recently hosted Mehmet Oz at Aspen's offices. And it sounds like, in listening to him, one major goal is rethinking research funding. Rather than giving block grants to large institutions, he says, like University of Michigan, where Asma teaches, or the American Cancer Society, NIH, it's more about like investing a bit like the NBA draft, like finding particular scientists or particular ideas to support. Are there unintended consequences? Of course. I think we have to look those in the eye today too. I think GLP-1s, which are a big deal, like Ozempic, like for losing weight quickly. Mehmet Oz said on Saturday that, where's the most commonly, zip code where that's most commonly used in the country? Is it in Mississippi? Is it in Texas? No, it's the Upper East Side of New York. It's used perhaps for a different purpose. Make America Healthy Again, the movement, is championing sweeping healthcare reforms. It's about slashing vaccine requirements, removing artificial dyes from the food we eat. According to the advocates, at least on social media, God is an anti-Vaxxer. So Ruth and Michael, just what's going on here? Help us understand, if you will. We're going to have two presentations in a row and then over to you. Rachael Bedard is an MD and an internist, geriatrician, and palliative care physician, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. She is a 2026 Type Media Fellow, and from 16 to 22, she worked with correctional health services, Rikers and other places, providing medical care in New York City's jails. She currently practices at Wood Hill Hospital in her clinic that supports the safety net and more. And then Michael Balboni is a Harvard Medical School instructor, but also a Christian pastor. And so Michael co-directs the Harvard Initiative on Health, Spirituality, and Religion, which he co-founded, while serving as the Congregational Pastor for Restoration Fellowship in Boston. He's co-authored books on the intersection of spirituality and religion with Harvard Medical School professor John Petit, and on caring for the dying and supporting hospitality at the end of life with his wife, Tracy. We're gonna go Rachael, and then Michael, and then you. Rachael, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I sneezed right before this, and now I have like a thing in my throat. So I'm hoping that resolves over the course of the next 25 minutes. What I want to do over this brief time, and I have to warn that I can talk about MAHA for a long time, because I think it's a really rich phenomenon, is I want to tell you a little bit about who I am, I want to share some stories from reporting sort of on the frontier of MAHA. I want to consider some of the theoretical underpinnings for the ideas that we are going to discuss, and convey something about why I think MAHA represents a pretty critical cultural movement that we should engage seriously. And just as Josh sort of just said, even as I think it also potentially poses significant danger. I also want to say up front that I'm going to talk mostly about MAHA as a cultural movement and less about Kennedy and less about what's happened in the administration over the past year, because I perceive Kennedy as a politician. I think he is a person who has his own political ambitions, and I think much of how he presents himself to the world and many of the decisions he makes are the kinds of transactional moves that people make who have designs on the White House, which I think he does. But I'm happy, of course, to take questions later or for us to have a conversation about the politics of MAHA or what the administration has done or might do this coming year. So let me start by sort of saying something about who I am. So as Josh said, I'm an internist, and my subspecialty training is in geriatrics and palliative care. Palliative care is taking care of people who are seriously ill or near the end of their lives. And it is a subspecialty that directly engages suffering of the body and existential suffering, and that's why I chose it. I chose it because I was very interested not just in taking care of people with complex illness, which is really interesting as a physician, but I was very drawn to the fact that palliative care directly engaged people's experience of illness, confrontations with their own mortality, the way that they tried to make meaning of suffering, the way that they thought about legacy, all of these things. And one of the sort of core tasks of palliative care, I think, is to offer people opportunities to exert agency in situations where they have little control. So people near the end of their lives feel incredible, or when even they're not necessarily dying, but are very sick, feel an enormous loss of control. Their hopes are often feel foreclosed, all of these things. One of the things that palliative care practitioners do is they try to find opportunities to give people choice within the reality of what they're facing. So without taking away the truth of what's happening to them, right? Being both sort of honest and forthright about what the situation is, and then saying, what can we do within this that can give you some measure of joy or peace or meaning? This is sort of a foreshadow, I think, of something that is going to come up through this talk, which is I was interested in palliative care for these reasons because it felt clear to me when I was in training that sort of all of the science in the world could not actually meaningfully resolve the sort of deeper types of suffering that people have who are very ill, didn't have the tools to help people understand the experiences that they were having. And that meaning, dignity, and agency just aren't clinical problems. The other thing, so I've had this unusual career, as Josh said, palliative care doctor by training. My first job out of many years of training was I worked on Rikers Island in the New York City jail system, where I had this unusual role as a jail-based geriatrician, which is like a really dark sounding term. I was the first jail-based geriatrician in the country. And my job there was that I would sort of start the day looking at a list of everybody in the jail system who was over 65, and I would try to meet them all. And I would provide clinical care and coordination of clinical care for those patients, but I also, over time, came to build a team and run this team that did court advocacy on behalf of these folks to try to get them out, because more often than not, people who had very serious illness or people who had geriatric impairment, it was just completely inappropriate for them to be in jail. It wasn't a care setting that could meet their needs. And so it was, jail is a context where sort of the dynamics are defined by mistrust, right? Like every interaction is contentious, basically by definition. And it is also a context defined by violence in a way that is totally sort of unique in American society, that in jails and prisons, they are places where the potential for every interaction to escalate to the laying of hands is there. And that's a really crazy context in which to practice medicine. And it really sort of lays bare the conflict between sort of state attempts at maintaining safety by controlling people's bodies and people's impulses to controlling their own bodies, and the sort of fierce attachment that people have to bodily autonomy. And what I sort of learned over time was that when you force people to choose between freedom and safety in situations where they don't trust you to honor their dignity, they choose freedom. They don't choose safety. And that also, I think, is a really important sort of underlying premise for the way that I read MAHA as sort of differently than many of my other colleagues in medicine. I now work in a homeless clinic 2 days a week, and then I write the rest of the time. So my whole career has sort of been with marginalized patients. And I've never taken care of a MAHA mom. Like, that's not my population. But many of the underlying sort of questions that I think drive the MAHA movement feel very familiar to me from the patient populations that I work in. And I will sort of share one story about that to get us started. So I was at Rikers during the COVID pandemic. In March of 2020, Rikers Island, which is very tiny, had the highest prevalence of COVID in the world. It was, as you can imagine, a really terrifying time. I worked 100 hours a week for several weeks in a row. It was a really wild time to be there. It was also this sort of funny moment where public health, there was a lot of deference to public health, and we did a lot of crazy things. We got a lot of people out of jail in a very short amount of time. In January of 2021, the agency that I worked for negotiated with this city to be able to offer our patients COVID vaccines early. Like, you guys remember, right at the beginning when the COVID vaccine was being rolled out, there were tons of sort of politics and discourse about who was gonna get the vaccines early, how were we prioritizing people. People in jail, jail is like the world's worst cruise ship. We made the argument to the city that our guys were particularly vulnerable. New York City was also doing this program where they were offering people in the community an incentive of $50 or $100 if you got both shots. And we argued to the city, my agency argued to the city, that we should offer an incentive to the folks who were inside as well. It was something like $30 into their commissary if they got both shots. This felt to myself and my colleagues like it was this huge sort of like victory for health equity. And I was on a team of people who walked around the jails offering people the vaccines very early, like in January or February of 21. And pretty smug about it all, you know, felt like we were really there to like offer people a thing that we assumed they were clamoring for. And we approached guys in their dorms and their cell blocks, and we said, come get the COVID vaccine, and if you come and get it, and you get both shots, you get 25 or 30 bucks in your commissary. And over, what did patients say? They said, why are you giving it to us first? And the government's never paid me to put anything in my body before. And it was such a fascinating and stark set of interactions for me, where I was like, of course, I've completely misjudged the politics of this moment for my patients. I completely misjudged what they want and what helps them feel safe with our care. Which is all to say that the anti-Vaxxers that I know, or the vax-hesitant people who I know, were incarcerated Black men. They were not like moms in Marin County. And that, I think, is an important point to sort of say, like, that the MAHA cultural phenomenon is spread across demographics, that MAHA, the sort of packaging, has given it this, like, particular aesthetic and class identity that that very much, I think, determines the way it gets covered, but that the questions that sort of underlie what MAHA is about are shared across demographics. And that the liberal dismissal of MAHA as like a pathology of like sort of wellness moms is itself sort of a form of class blindness, I think. Okay, so that's my background. Over the past year and a half, I've been reporting and writing about MAHA a lot. In the fall, I went to the Children's Health Defense meeting, annual meeting. Do people know what that is? Children's Health Defense is it was Bobby Kennedy's sort of home organization for the decade before he ran for president. It is sort of the most prominent and well-funded, well-resourced anti-vaccine organization in the country. At this meeting, which was a really fascinating and wild and totally eye-opening experience, there was this one particular moment that was very intense for me. It was in Austin, Texas. And there was a panel called Breaking the Mainstream Measles Narrative. And the people who had been listed to be on the panel were like these CHD leaders who are sort of these MAHA influencer, anti-vax luminaries. But when the panel walked on stage, there was a member who hadn't been in the program. And that was the father of one of the kids who had died of measles in West Texas last year. In 2025, there were 2 children who died of measles. It was the first time that America has had measles deaths this century. And this was this young Mennonite guy, and he came on stage. Everybody else on stage was like a really practiced podcaster, like doing shtick, basically. And this guy sat mostly quietly and was very tearful. And he told us about his daughter. And he told us about her illness. And he had allied with Children's Health Defense because they had basically come and sort of swept him up in the wake of his daughter's death. And they had offered him this alternative narrative about what had happened to her, in which she had died not of the measles itself, but of downstream sort of infections that they told him had been misdiagnosed and undertreated in the hospital. And he was convinced by that account. And rather than coming out of this devastating loss with the feeling that, he'd rethought something about the measles vaccine, he in fact felt affirmed in his decision not to vaccinate. And he talked about how he had, I don't know, like 6 other kids, and he was never gonna vaccinate any of them. This was Texas, you know, try to come for them. He'd meet you on his porch. He ended his remarks with, God bless Children's Health Defense, God bless Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and God bless Donald Trump. And it was stunning for me and unbelievably moving to hear that, because he was incredibly raw. And I sort of spent the whole rest of that day thinking, like, basically, like, how did they get him? Like, how did they get him, and how did they bring him here? And I was talking to a friend a week later who had grown up in the evangelical church and subsequently left, and I was describing it. And she said, oh, what he was doing is called testimony. He was giving testimony about his experience, which was, she described as speaking the story of how you came to your truth and how it helped you find your life's purpose. Testimony is an opportunity to find sort of catharsis, community, and a calling all at once. And he had sort of transmuted this grief that he was still very much experiencing into connection with a cause. And that cause was Children's Health Defense and this anti-vaccine movement. And that insight was really helpful to me and really powerful to me in helping me think about MAHA as meaning-making for people who have endured trauma, either themselves or more often than not their children, due to illness or due to interactions with the healthcare system. that left them feeling deeply alienated, where they did not have a way to make meaning of those experiences, and MAHA offers them that. There had been a moment at the beginning of the Children's Health Defense conference where a guy named Del Bigtree, who's like a big leader in this movement, had said, please stand if you or someone in your immediate family has suffered vaccine injury. And 80% of the room stood. People who gathered there were people who felt that they had gone through difficulty. And in sort of an exilic way, it had clarified purpose for them. And they had come together, they made community. That community gave them meaning and sort of turned pain into strength. So that's a really different lens, I think, on the anti-vax part of the MAHA story than what is sort of usually, how it's usually represented, I think, especially in sort of the liberal mainstream media. The reflexive response from journalists, physicians, and public health officials is that MAHA is an anti-science movement, that it's sort of, it denies evidence, they promote pseudoscience, that it's like driven by grifters, and its very existence is sort of taken as evidence of this like epistemic crisis that John referred to yesterday. But I think that framing, and so it's also often sort of characterized and treated as a misinformation problem, right? But I think that framing is a real category error. I don't think MAHA is primarily about sort of contested facts. I think it's about two things. I think it's about contested values, and we can talk about that a little bit. And then I think it's about contested authority. Who gets to just sort of decide what the story is about people's bodies, whose knowledge counts, and what the body means. And so without being too academic about it, I just want to share sort of a couple of context sort of theoretical underpinnings that I think help illustrate the idea that this isn't a new phenomenon at all. The other thing that I think gets sort of misrepresented about MAHA a lot is that it gets described as like one very much like a Kennedy-driven phenomenon, a Kennedy-created phenomenon. Partly, I think that's the MAHA branding, which is like MAGA adjacent, and in the way that MAGA coalesced around Trump. I think MAHA is sort of presumed to be a movement around and about Kennedy. I don't think that that's accurate. But also, I think people really think that it sort of was forged or at least very much accelerated during the pandemic. And although I think the pandemic did intensify a bunch of trends, those trends were there long before the pandemic. I think that the pandemic is better understood as something that exposed a lot of these tensions rather than created them. So there are a few sort of theoretical things I want to talk about. The first is the relationship of the body to the state is this sort of tension that's been around since the founding of the nation. The theorist Michel Foucault had this idea of biopolitics. Biopolitics was this idea that the function of the modern state is to control life. Foucault talked about sort of the pre-modern state as being a state that controlled death, where authority could decide who would die on behalf of the country, that monarchs could take people's lives, but that the modern state is organized around granting, extending, and controlling life, population health dynamics, thinking about resource allocation, right? All of these things. And I find that very useful in helping me think about this tension between what the state as sort of an arbiter of our health, our individual health, and our population health, and why there is tension when people feel as though when people feel that they are under threat because their body is misunderstood by the state. The second sort of theoretical thing I want to reference is there's a cultural anthropologist named Mary Douglas. Has anybody ever read Purity and Danger? Purity and Danger is this amazing text where Douglas makes this argument about that the body's not just a body, it's a map of social order, and that dirt and pollution and contamination are socially constructed categories. So like, you know, some people let shoes into their house, some people don't let shoes into their house. And that's because they have different attitudes about what counts as dirty and what counts as dangerous and what counts as contamination. Kennedy has been preoccupied with contamination his entire career, right? Starting from the 80s when he worked with the river keepers and on cleaning up the Hudson River, through work on factory farming, through work on, Kennedy was the lead advocate who led to the closure of Indian Point, which was the nuclear energy site that powered New York City, now closed, creating an energy crisis for New York City. And then also the vaccine stuff. So this preoccupation with contamination is like this through line in his career, and it's very much a through line in the MAHA worldview. And folks who are sort of subscribed to MAHA ideas are really concerned about the body as a site of purity that can be assaulted from without by contaminant, and and vaccines represent that contamination, obviously, but also air pollution, water pollution, ultra-processed foods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that this all reflects sort of a corruption from above, and corrupt priests who are like the scientists who sort of bless that kind of, who make that sound like it's okay when actually it's not. MAHA is often sort of accused of not believing in germ theory. Kennedy sometimes sort of says things that make it sound like he doesn't believe in germ theory. It's a little bit of an oversimplification. I think it's not that they don't believe in bacteria or viruses, and it's not that they don't believe that those things make you sick, but they basically believe that organic matter, bugs, are cleaner and purer than things that are than contaminants that result from like man-made matter. So they're more concerned about pollution and they're more concerned about chemical additives in vaccines than they are about viruses and bacteria. They subscribe to something called terrain theory. Terrain theory is basically the idea that the way to prevent illness is to fortify the terrain of your body to be able to fight off what happens to it. Kennedy often repeats this sort of incorrect assertion that measles doesn't kill healthy children, that measles kills kids who are in some way already weakened by illness or other underlying vulnerability. So biopolitics, Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger, thinking about sort of terrain theory as an alternative to germ theory, or as a complement to germ theory, that helps make sense of everything. And then the last thing is the last sort of theoretical thing I'll talk about is, do people know Jonathan Metzl? He's a psychiatrist. He wrote a book in 2019 called, what's it called? Dying of Whiteness. Does that ring a bell for people? Yeah. So in 2010, he co-edited a book called Against Health, in which Metzl makes this like sort of provocative assertion that health is the new morality, that, and it dovetails really nicely with Foucault's ideas about biopolitics, that health is a way in which health is a moral category, and that being healthy is coded as virtuous and disciplined and responsible. Health ideas are never neutral, and that citizenship and belonging has become sort of negotiated by drawing equivalences between health, a particular idea of what health looks like, and being good and being virtuous. And that precedes Kennedy, it precedes MAHA by 15 years, right? And it's not a critique of sort of the MAHA movement in any way. It's a critique of sort of mainstream medicine and the way that mainstream medicine shapes ideas about morality. But it also very much aligns with the way that MAHA speaks about health as so entangled with virtue, right? The purity piece, it offers moral identity. It very much, the MAHA mom thing is very much about being a good parent by protecting your child from the way in which the world is attempting to harm it, either passively or actively. Kennedy talks a lot about health and patriotism as being entwined. One of his sort of favorite refrains is about how 70% of young Americans would not be fit for military service because they're too obese or have chronic conditions. He really sort of talks about the health, the movement that he's sort of created that's oriented around health as being about restoring America to peak fitness, right? And to being able to be, he often says, sort of as it was when his uncle was president. Okay, so those are some underpinnings of sort of the way that MAHA understands the world, but also I'm trying to sort of say that none of that is sui generis to MAHA. It all precedes it, and it has sort of long roots. The sort of next thing I want to talk about is this that Josh talked about at CHD. Somebody delved Bigtree again, said God is an anti-Vaxxer. Folks in MAHA are spiritual. Sometimes they belong to organized religion, sometimes they don't, but they very much have ideas about the natural, and they have ideas about God. And they don't see those ideas as necessarily being, they're not anti-science, and they don't see those ideas as being anti-science. And that is not atypical for people who practice religion in America generally. So there was this really interesting Pew survey recently that asked people about whether they thought religion and science were compatible. And among patients with participants, among participants in this survey who identified as secular, who had low religious engagement, 73% said that science and religion were mostly in conflict. But among people who identified as religious and had religion in their lives, only 35% of people saw them in conflict, which is to say that people who have beliefs that inform the stories they tell themselves about their bodies, the stories they tell themselves about the world, they don't necessarily see science as a challenge to that or as incompatible with that. But secularists devoted to sort of what I'll call establishment science are incredibly orthodox and rigid, actually, at being able to see the possibility that there may be other sort of rational ways of understanding the world that could be compatible with their own. So the last sort of thing I'll say about that is that MAHA is, to try to put together the ways in which the MAHA sort of has all of this religious undertone, but sees itself as compatible with science and what that's in reaction to. It reflects, I think, sort of this collapse of establishment science's monopoly on truth over the last 20 years. So with the emergence of the internet, but also with the emergence of mass marketing around scientific product, right? So like pharma ads, et cetera, that sort of make these bold, that sort of employ what's called epistemic hype around, I'm gonna wrap up. Mass marketing around health products, the emergence of the internet, and the sort of increased scientization of politics, right? The reliance on expert input to determine policy in a way that sort of elides whether or not there are values implicit in the recommendations being made. All of that sort of did come to a head in the pandemic, right? Where it became exposed that much of what scientists were saying was in some way speculative, right? And not necessarily a reflection of some particular insight around truth, and not necessarily a reflection of particular dominion over what was right. In the wake of that collapse of authority, MAHA sort of comes in and fills the vacuum to some degree and offers people an alternative. And there's a guy named Dan Sarowitz, who's a really thoughtful scholar of science and society, who talks about this as like a new reformation, basically, that what we are living through is the collapse of the unitary authority of secular science. And what we should hope for is an opportunity for the flourishing of plural rationalities that can coexist in circumstances of uncertainty. And that, I think, is sort of the best case scenario for what MAHA could be. The worst case scenario for what MAHA could be is the replacement of one set of orthodoxies with another. And that, I think, is what we've seen in the past year in terms of what the administration has been putting out, which is a lot of critique of the expert class, but then sort of the importation of like a new expert class that just dispenses with the old experts' opinions and replaces them with their own. But there's a lot of opportunity here, I think, to take people's real anxieties, feelings, need for meaning, different ways of understanding their bodies, different ways of understanding the world, and sort of deep humility about the uncertainty around all of this, and thinking of new ways in which to make sense of all of that in the same way, in a way that sort of allows for a pluralism of knowledge generation. And that's the potential, I think, of this movement. I'm going to stop because I got a note. But thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
Rachel, I think you have that's really fascinating, and I thought, yeah, penetrating analysis, and it's worth pursuing. Yeah, really, I learned something from you. Thank you. So a little bit about me. I'm not a physician, so just to put that out there. I have worked at Harvard Medical School, but I'm coming at things as a religious scholar. So I'm trained in religion and theology, and have looked at the role of religion and spirituality within the practice of medicine. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm married to a physician by the same last name, Tracy Balboni, and we have worked together for 25 years, where we began to see that medicine and religion could be not just could be wonderful bedfellows, and that they belong together in many ways. And we set off to begin to try to understand and explore that through research and through our shared experiences. She as a physician, a cancer doctor, and a palliative care physician, and then I also working as a pastor, and as a pastor with people who are working within medicine. So I'm not a physician. I'm not a scientist. I really avoid politics. So this is, and I'm very uncomfortable speaking to journalists. So that's
it's wonderful to have you.
And I don't know too much about vaccines, but I took this as an assignment to jump into this and to try to figure it out a little bit, because I do know something about religion and medicine. So let me just begin by saying that the science has been pretty clear. Large epidemiological studies that have been done as early as 2002, population-based studies in Denmark, as well as meta-analysis in the US, UK, Denmark, Japan, and Poland, looking at over more than 1 million participants, all of which, I mean, the studies are pretty simple. You're comparing the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated, and after adjusting for many kinds of confounding factors, asking the question, is autism among those who are among the vaccinated? And the answer is no. There's no statistical difference between the two groups, even after adjusting for all the confounding factors. These are some of the best kinds of studies that we have, and the science has been pretty clear. And so that's something that why the scientific community and public health community continue to say that vaccines, and I'm going to focus thoughts on vaccines, if that's okay, why vaccines are not associated with autism. But then I decided to start to interview people, parents who believe vaccines are associated with autism. And I don't know if you've ever done that or have children who have autism and they believe the vaccines cause that. And I definitely recommend that you do that if you're interested in pursuing this topic. Here's a few things that I found. I interviewed a few mothers just last week just to kind of launch into this so I could hear personal accounts. And these mothers describe the moment of vaccination as seeing a major change in their child's behavior. The mothers talk about seeing the signs of autism early, and that their doctors and caregivers couldn't see it, and that being another source of growing distrust. They don't see what I'm seeing, and it's definitely there. And later on, it proved to be there, and they didn't see it, and it required the parents' advocacy to finally to get through. That the experience of having medical professionals minimize or reject their concerns when they, based on their own personal experience, they know that these things are absolutely true. And then it causing for growing distrust towards the medical community and pushing them into personal research. One mother said to me, I believed in modern medicine. I never really questioned giving my kids vaccines. And then another saying, it kind of rocked my world. It made me feel like I didn't know who I could trust anymore, having kind of experienced the medical community and its rejection of their claims. And I also began to realize that these mothers feel incredibly guilty about the emotional pain. One said, I can't believe I did this to my kids. There's no way I can take it back. Another said to me, I still struggle with the guilt. And now my child is 15 years old. So these are parents who believe that they, by consenting to the medical community, they cause their child's suffering, and by consequence, their own suffering. And it also pushes them to seek alternative and independent action, looking for going outside of conventional medical pathways in order to find help. Just to read in a few, just so you can kind of hear a little bit in one mother's own words. She said, when my younger son turned 1, I took him in for vaccines. A nurse practitioner came in, and she saw that the way she looked at me, and I didn't understand why she was looking at me so strangely. And she said to me in a strange tone, I see that your older son has autism. Are there any vaccines that you might want to skip today with your other son? And I immediately thought, wait a second, what do you know that I don't know? And so she began to experience some degree of suspicion. And she said, we decided to leave without getting the vaccine. Afterward, I kept thinking about the interaction. She seemed nervous, like she wasn't supposed to say that. And I waited, and I started hearing about delayed vaccine schedules. Some doctors were saying to space vaccines out and to give them one at a time. And she said there were lots of pressure from doctors, family, and society to vaccinate. So I decided I would give, this is her second child, give him one vaccine and space them out slowly. I avoided the vaccines that the other parents in the autism community most often blamed. Instead, I picked a different one. We took him in at 2.5 years old. This is the part I really want you to hear. He was a perfectly normal child in every way. We ran one errand after the appointment of receiving the vaccine, and then we went home. And by the time we got home, it was immediately obvious that something had happened. He was flapping his hands, running in circles on his toes, rolling his eyes, screaming and slamming himself into walls. He had never done anything like that before. I still struggle with the guilt, and now he's 15 years old. I had reasons to suspect something might happen, but I went ahead with the vaccine anyway. Seeing a completely normal child suddenly show severe autistic behaviors crushed me. I felt like I had broken my child. Before that, he had been fully potty trained at age 2. On his 2nd birthday, he looked at me in the eye and he said, "I'm a big boy now, no more diapers. I'm going to use the potty like a big boy." And he did, and he didn't have any accidents. But then after the vaccine at 2.5, he lost his ability immediately and he went back into diapers for another year. And then he developed major sensory issues. He became a sensory seeker, constantly making noise, drumming, humming, singing, and she kind of goes on to describe a bunch of his symptoms. She continues saying, as far as what sources I found this interesting, as far as what sources I turned to for information, that was hard. It kind of rocked my world. It made me feel like I didn't know who I could trust anymore. Obviously, as you said, it doesn't happen to everyone. I'm vaccinated. I'm not autistic. Plenty of people are vaccinated and not autistic. So I don't really know who to trust and what sources to go to. But something clearly happened to my son between the doctor's office and our house, and for him it was extremely obvious, and that pushed me right into that group of people who believe that the vaccines caused it. I also, during this interview, I asked her, I said, I'm meeting with some journalists, and is there anything that you would like them to know? And she said that we have no reason to make this up. We don't benefit in any way from making it up. We don't benefit from speaking out about it. And when we do, we get mocked. Oftentimes we're shunned. We lose our friends and family members. We get kicked out of doctors' offices, which is something I've kind of learned from multiple mothers, is that they're getting pushed out of pediatric practices because they're refusing vaccines. We get kicked out of schools. It's a hard road to stand up for this. It's not easy, and we don't benefit from it at all. Maybe if journalists think about that, they would wonder, why then are we so adamant that this is true? Why would people make it up if it only hurts them to talk about it? We must have seen something truly radical happen before our eyes. I want them to consider that and just think about it. Anyway, it's worth kind of hearing it in their own words, and so I just kind of put that before you to consider. Vaccine hesitancy is it's certainly a growing phenomena in the United States. It's not fringe, and it's not crazy people. It's a lot of people in the U.S. And we're seeing shifts and changes within American attitudes. According to Gallup, I think it's Gallup, in 2001, 94% of Americans said that childhood vaccines were very important. But now in 2024, 69% agree. That's a 25% shift in the U.S. population. According to Gallup, should government require parents to vaccinate children? In 1992, 82% essentially agreed. And in 2024, 51% agreed that the government should require parents to vaccinate children. It's a 31% drop, and it's hardly a majority. I was stunned to learn that. According to Pew, 53% believe that vaccines have been sufficiently tested. So there's not a lot of trust, or there's barely a majority who believe that. This is stunning, 51% believed that children's vaccine schedules are safe. Gallup found that 20% believe that vaccines are more dangerous than the diseases that they protect. 51% of US adults are unsure if vaccines cause autism. And then there are a number of studies, there's a number of studies from 20 to 40% of parents with children with autism believe that the vaccines cause the autism. That's a lot of people. 20 to 40% of parents with autism believe the vaccines cause the autism. So is religion, to what degree is religion playing a role in this? It's not exactly clear to me, but I think the standard kind of Christian thinking around vaccines goes something like this: that medicine is a good gift of God. It's discovered through human wisdom, but it's a blessing, and it's a gift given by God. And that health and healing they can be they're also given by God and mediated through medicine. So medicine is a gift of God in which God's health and healing are mediated through and are to be received as something that's given by God as a blessing. So vaccines are gifts of God, discovered by wisdom, granted by God for protection, especially for children. And therefore, we have a moral obligation to protect our children out of love from these diseases, and to reject vaccines for oneself or for one's children, or in order to protect one's neighbor, is to reject God's good gift, and it's to act selfishly, failing to love one's neighbor. I think that's kind of the standard kind of Christian way of reasoning around medicine in general, and around vaccines, and I think there's historically it's Christians, the church, clergy have been aligned for the most part. I mean, there are exceptions, but they've been aligned with vaccines. But I would suggest there are 7. At least I had 9. I've gone down to 7. I could probably go down to 4 or 5 if you want to kind of, depending on how you want to categorize them. But here are 7 arguments that I'm hearing as I'm talking to people on religious reasons on why vaccines are not a good idea. And it's not clear. I mean, I think some of these are kind of post hoc explanations. They're not the real reason. There are real reasons, but they're not the initial reasons that's causing them not to get vaccines. But then they're turning to religion and religious theological rationales to help explain their behavior, if you will. So here, number 1, abortion is linked to vaccine development. I cannot in good conscience accept a vaccine that I believe is connected even indirectly to abortion. I have to answer to God for the moral choices I make for my children. So I think rubella is one of the vaccines that's still connected to aborted fetal cells, and there is a sense of being complicit to abortion by participating in those vaccines. The mothers I interviewed both referenced this argument. 2, government overreach and parental conscience, something that kind of Rachel was alluding to. God gave me the responsibility to raise and protect our children, not the government. No state has the right to force a medical decision that violates my good conscience carefully formed before God. So there's this sense of which government doesn't have a right to directly impose something upon us. And then it kind of goes right into bodily stewardship and consent. You're referencing Mary Douglas. The mothers I interviewed both talked about the body being the temple of the Holy Spirit. And as a temple, it is not, there's something objectionable about putting a poison by the industry. That's the kind of language that I'm hearing some people use. My child's body is not the property of the state or the medical system. If the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, then any decision about it must be made prayerfully and freely, not under pressure, the violation of the body. And that it kind of flows into another, number 4, there's this natural order of natural immunity. Some see vaccines as interfering with the body's God-designed natural defenses, and they prefer immunity developed through the body's own processes. I believe God designed the body with the ability to fight illness naturally. I want to trust the natural immune defenses God has already created, not trust in foreign chemicals to save me. Number 5, there's concern about weakening moral teaching, particularly about the HPV vaccine. I don't want to give my daughter the message that we should plan medically for sexual sin instead of teaching holiness, self-control, and obedience to God. And a lot of parents question at early adolescence whether they should give their child the HPV vaccine, which is contracted specifically through sexual activity. And so, if my child is going to follow God's law around sex and only have sex within marriage, they have nothing to worry about, and there's no reason for that vaccine. I've had other parents say specifically to me, I hope my child doesn't do that, but I'm going to protect them anyway. in case they do, because they may make really bad choices within our culture, and I'm going to buy them time to repent, if that makes sense. Number 6, trust in God, not in human interventions. I don't want to fear. I do not want fear to push me into putting human solutions above faith. There are risks both ways. I'll take my chances with God. And number 7, and I think this is the most important one, there is fundamental distrust of the scientific and medical institutions. There's a resistance that's been shaped by a suspicion toward pharmaceutical companies, public health agencies, which often scientific authorities, which have become increasingly politicized, profit-driven, many of which are hostile to religious beliefs. I definitely have seen that. I don't believe these institutions are neutral. Too often they seem driven by money, politics, and contempt for people of faith. So I'm not ready to hand over unquestioning trust when it comes to my children. So let me just dive in. The last kind of section here is just the breakdown of trust. There's been a historical unity between medicine, the medical community, and the church, and Christianity in general. Medicine and health are ways to show care, love, and hospitality to the most vulnerable. And many Christians have been historically and even currently, they practice medicine and public health. I know a lot of Christians who go into medicine and public health out of their religious convictions. That's why they're there. They want to care for the vulnerable, and it's their religious faith that's actually driving them to make these sorts of decisions. And as I alluded to, vaccines have been historically promoted by Christians. Like, for example, the smallpox vaccine was developed by clergy in Britain and in New England. And it was the clergy in these places that were advancing the smallpox vaccine as a gift of God, and should be received as a gift of God to protect us from the evils of disease. And it's also the case that the church has started and continues to lead many health institutions across the world, including in the United States. For example, the 5,000 plus hospitals that are overseen by the Roman Catholic Church. So there is that real unity and sense of connection and trust that is there, but yet distrust is also real and pervasive and towards both academic medicine and public health. And I think in some ways there's been a failure within those institutions of academic medicine and public health, which they're not really owning their part in creating distrust. So, when you think about medicine, there's incredibly powerful social forces growing in kind of creating an impersonal relationships between their physicians and caregivers and patients. Social forces such as bureaucracy, scientific objectification, and market forces, the highlighting of efficiency, which minimizes time and the relationship between the physician-patient relationship, that relationship which is increasingly corroding, in which you have actually no relationship. The so-called family doctor of prior generations is gone. That relationship created trust over an extended period of time, and now there is no relationship with that kind of person in which you can go to. They know your name, they know your family, they know your children, and they travel with you through time. It's gone. For the most part, it's gone. And then I think another force around distrust is coercive government pressure through using medical relationships. This vaccinate or else, penalties for not vaccinating, not being able to send your child to public school or in many cases private school, losses of job, families being pushed out of pediatric practices, which is a pretty frustrating experience for the mothers that I've been talking to, and coercive pressures to force people to go against their religiously informed conscience. There's a number of states now that do not have allow for religious objections to receiving vaccines, including California and New York, which is, you put that together, it's 18% of the US population has no means to have any kind of religious objection. There's a kind of a dismissal of and false characterization of parents who are searching for answers, who are carrying guilt, who feel unheard and abandoned by the medical community. The MAHA hospital, I don't know if you saw the Saturday Night Live thing, it's funny, it's satire, but it's also making fun of people who are suffering and who are carrying guilt. And that's a juxtaposition you have to kind of scratch your head around. And there is this, we've talked about the epistemic fracture. There's, on the one hand, as I started with, scientific evidence of p-values, linear and logistic regression, meta-analyses. But to more and more people, that sounds like hocus pocus and magic. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense in light of a mother's experience who got the vaccine, drove home, and her child is different. Like, which one are you going to believe? And then I would just finally, I'll close by saying COVID-19, I think, is the final straw. That is what's fundamentally and kind of brought about a major change. There's incredible animosity towards in the COVID-19 vaccination is lumped together with childhood vaccines. There's no way I was taking that vaccine. One person said to me, they developed so quickly, they weren't really authorized well, there's not enough long-term data available to assess their long-range effects. The mandates have put in bitterness within many religious people. People lost their jobs for refusing to take the jab, is kind of the language I hear. Churches will never again be bullied into not meeting because of a pandemic. One person said to me, we learn not to trust the medical authorities. We will never give in to fear again in the fear mongering. Some believe there's been cover-up around COVID. And then I'll just close with some of the irrational, the sense of irrationality around masking and the various kinds of social policies that we all went through and experienced. Within this group, they're saying these things that we were told to do, masking kind of being a great example, demonstrates how irrational it all. It didn't make any sense, which only aids and furthers the sense of distrust. One businessman said, I was flying first class, I was on British Airways on my way home. The flight attendant, the lead flight attendant came up to, he was in one of those fancy cubbies. And the flight attendant said, sir, would you please put your mask on? I've noticed you haven't had it on for a while. And the man looked around and he said, you see all these other people, they're not wearing a mask right now. Why? I don't really want to put it back on. And and she said, that's our policy. It's to protect everyone. And he said, why? They're not wearing masks now. Why do I need to put it back? Why do I need to put it back on? And she continued to insist. And then he asked her, well, if I have a drink, do I have to wear the mask? And she said, no, sir. And then he said, well, would you please get me another glass of Cabernet? And as you do, would you please consider the inconsistency of what you're asking? And I'll close there.
Great.
So great.
All right, over to you, Ashley Parker from the Washington Post. Up first.
Thank you. So this is to both of you, but maybe it's referring to something Michael mentioned, which is, I know a lot of people who you mentioned first this idea of even when you look at all the different factors, there's no relationship between vaccines and autism. And there's a lot of people in my life who I know both believe in scientific evidence and almost believe in it as a point of pride, as part of their identity. But then you also read that mother's very compelling words. And I have to assume that some of these people, if that was a friend of theirs who told that experience to them or, put it on Facebook, it would feel like a very compelling anecdote. And I'm curious how you reconcile what you know and seem to believe about the science versus that interview you did with a mother, like how you understand them both.
I think we have to approach things humbly. And that's not a cop-out. I think we don't know things. And so we need people who are going to humbly approach this, set aside all the politics, and really try to listen. As I've been talking to some young pediatricians, I was asking them about this, and like, how are they approaching this? And one, she's a first-year intern at Boston Children's Hospital. She kind of just got all flustered and frustrated. It's like, just take the, I just want them to take the vax and be done with it. But I think that's not the right attitude. And, I don't know. I was talking to my wife. She's the scientist. Like, I'm just I don't know much about this. I don't know how to make sense of it. And then we're talking specifically about this mother's experience. And my wife, Tracy, kind of wondered whether within autistic experience there's a kind of the hypersensitivity around noise and sometimes touch. And then she began to wonder, is it possible that it's not the vaccine? Is it possible that it's actually the needle, in the experience of having the needle injected into you, that's triggering some kind of initial autistic response? Like, we've kind of like poked around for the last week, seeing if anyone's kind of done any research on that, and we haven't found anything. Maybe it's out there, we just haven't had enough time to. But that could be a kind of, is that something that's happening, where the actual experience of being stuck is triggering something within a child who has autism, but it hasn't really manifested in a way that's been clear up until that moment. And so that could be one possible way of where these things can coexist at the same time. So I don't know. It's hard to make sense of it, and I don't think we know. We need to be humble. We don't know everything, and we need more people working on it.
I'll just say 3 really short things. The first is that there's a phenomenon called lay epidemiology, which is sort of the label given to, there's what you sort of know to be the statistic, like sort of large statistics, and then there's what you know from the experiences of the people in your life. And if you know somebody who had a significant side effect to a medication, people very understandably anchor around those known personal anecdotes in a way that's very different than their relationship to large statistical data. Lay epidemiology sort of beats regular epidemiology for people. The second thing that I'll say is that there's tons of conflict around this. So lots of sort of heroic stories of the progress of medicine, especially in American culture, are about people insisting on things that other people told them were wrong until they end up being proven right. Or are about sort of a contest between patients with lived experience and scientists who refuse to take them seriously. The story of the HIV movement, right, of ACT UP, is about patients who insisted on setting a research agenda that scientists initially did not want, or and research processes that weren't what the FDA had done traditionally, right? And that's like a story about the democratization of science and heroism. Those sort of narratives conflict, I think, in a lot of ways with the sort of image of these disability moms who see themselves very much as a patient population, or parents of patients who are advocating for things they believe in. The third thing I'll say is that they are doing it with a lot of science. There is tons of research to support their perspective, because there are lots of people who are friendly to that perspective who have generated research to support their views. There are no women in STEM like MAHA moms. Those ladies show up with like an unbelievable stack of papers to support all of their assertions. They're just it is a pile of evidence that contradicts the evidence that is generally accepted by the scientific establishment. And I think for sort of not being willing to engage all of that nuance and complexity, it becomes harder for us to say, look, the evidence around the safety of the MMR is as strong as any evidence we have in medicine. Like I'm ready to hang my hat on it. There are lots of other things that I don't feel that way about in medicine, but that I am willing to hang my hat on. But for us to be able to sort of make that kind of distinction, I think we do have to acknowledge that there is a real breadth of reliability and lots of questions. And often I think on the science side, we foreclose that.
All right, we got 6 people in the queue, and we're going to take a break at 10:30 to check out. So let's keep moving. Let's even get 2 more in before the break. Kelsey Dallas.
Yeah, thank you both. I was struck hearing the anecdote from Michael about one of the mom's interactions with a doctor where the doctor said something like, oh, your older child seems to have autism. Are you considering skipping the vaccines today? And it just struck me, I don't know, that the doctor was maybe trying to create an opening to conversation, but then it was interpreted by the mom as like an acceptance of the belief that vaccines played a role in autism. And so that sort of played into my idea that as you create solutions for doctors to express humility and be welcoming, you also have to deal with the fact that doctors are humans and can be very awkward in these interactions.
No doubt.
And their effort to be kind and caring can then be taken as like an affirmation of these MAHA beliefs. And so this isn't a very helpful question, but just like, what do you do with that? With the idea that you need to equip doctors to do something in response, but you have to be aware that their implementation of that response could be off for what it's planned to be.
That's it's a good point. It's a great question. I'm not sure.
You just have to make more doctors like Tracy.
I think it depends. So there's lots and lots of efforts around training doctors to be better communicators. I think around these questions, how successful those efforts are will depend a lot on whether the frame of the training is here's how you convince people to do what you want them to do versus here's how you have an encounter with the patient in which you're really listening to them. And the second, I think, gets you to places where you have the burden is less on you saying the right words and more on you listening with sincerity to what people are telling you. The first is the way that a lot of medical communication courses get taught.
Good. Eleanor Habana from Texas.
Thank you guys so much for this. I have been covering Texas's litigation against Tylenol or against Johnson & Johnson, and the sort of, as I'm sure many of you guys know, like RFK Jr., but also President Trump sort of made these like sweeping comments about how taking Tylenol during pregnancy causes autism, which they've since sort of moderated their stances on. And Texas sort of took up the cause, suing Johnson & Johnson and Kenvue. It to me was like such a fascinating moment because all of these because it was Donald Trump who said this. I mean, there has been litigation going on for years from people saying that they believe that taking Tylenol during pregnancy caused their child's autism. And it was somewhat apolitical, or it was like people who sort of did not sort of identify with a political identity. Also, like Johnson & Johnson is a company that has long sort of like evaded regulation. They've been sued for filth for like most of their existence. You now have these sort of left-leaning people because it was Trump who said this, saying like, I trust this company, like I trust Tylenol, like there's no way, like, I'm going to take Tylenol when I'm pregnant just to sort of prove a point. And really, I saw like in a lot of media coverage, like really overstating how much we know about this. Like we will never be able to do a study to prove that Tylenol does or does not cause autism because we're not going to give pregnant women Tylenol to see if it causes autism. So like a lot of the science got like very overstated in the sense that like surely Trump and RFK are overstating, which they were, but like I'm just curious what we're seeing on sort of the other, if we think about MAHA, although it is not exclusively a right-leaning group, But what we're seeing on the other side too, that's like, you know, there's no way this can all be, that any of this can be true because it's coming from the MAGA movement, sort of.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important and perceptive point about sort of the way in which the Kennedy's rise and then especially the MAHA-MAGA alliance have hyper-partisanized a lot of questions around this in a way that one totally, I think it does a real disservice to everybody. Like it's a really bad thing for vaccines to become a democratic issue. We really need everybody to take them for them to matter, right? And so, you know, like the thing that I'm the most sort of anxious about is that we're turning vaccines into climate change, which is like sort of a universal problem where there's some contested science and we are hyper-partisanizing it to belong to one party in opposition to the other. But the other thing is, I think exactly what you're saying is true, which is that we, in response to what feels like this siege from Kennedy, Trump, et cetera, rather than engage around sort of the concerns with some epistemic humility, the like impulse is to respond with sort of excessive certainty. And that's a real setup to later on be disproven in small ways. And that's really what the story of COVID, right? Is that people made very, very hard decisions in an urgent moment without a lot of information to preference collective safety over individual autonomy. And some of those decisions proved right, and some were probably overcalls or misjudged. And had all of that been communicated with more recognition of uncertainty, it might have landed differently. But it was partly the certainty with which things were, you know, the factiness of it all, that I think got us into a lot of trouble.
I will just add briefly, if I may. What you're saying, so I was doing like or in early 2025, was doing like a 5-year look back at Texas's COVID response when the measles outbreak happened. And this public health expert, or public health administrator on the ground in West Texas, was saying like, I talked to all these experts and academics and national people about like, people need to take vaccines and all this stuff. And he was like, they're talking about climate change. Like, I'm talking about the weather, like bring an umbrella, right? Like we're not gonna get people to take vaccines by being like, all these experts think you should take vaccines. Like, so I have to like operate in the reality. And he basically was like, the problem was that during COVID, we presented this as a certainty that later turned out to be, at least in people's minds, like
Totally
mushier. And now we have lost that trust, or they have lost that trust.
The Lubbock County public health officials are the best.
Heroes.
They're absolute heroes who just managed an impossible and terrifying situation with an incredible amount of humility and grace and connectedness to their community. And they're the best. I wish everybody listened to them more.
Yeah.
Can we do one more from Jacob Rapushkin at Inside Elections?
Yeah. It seems like so much of what we've talked about today has been through the frame of individuality. You know, it goes against my religious beliefs, or it is a belief that it's my responsibility to prepare my body to be the healthiest to fend off whatever sort of, incursion it might experience. And I wonder how people who hold these beliefs about vaccines and other medical interventions more generally think about community and think about their responsibilities not just to themselves or their children as a kind of extensions of themselves, the responsibility you have to your child, but to their neighbor and to the people that you don't know. And I come at this from a particular perspective. I've been on immunosuppressants for most of my life, and so I see this in a particular way, but I wonder, there are a lot of people, Rachel, like you said, for whom it's important that other people are taking vaccines, right? That you develop that herd immunity, that you develop a community that is keeping everyone safe. And so how do you kind of reconcile those individualistic concerns with the responsibility that people feel to their community, and do they feel that responsibility at all?
Do you want to go first, Michael?
You're doing really well.
I think that one of the things that they would say is that vaccines are sort of part of this picture, part of this larger issue set that they're very interested in. And they would point to a million ways in which they think we allow each other to be, we sort of collectively consent to be exposed to things that make us all less healthy. Like we allow the air to be polluted and the water to be polluted, and we, like, I think one of the things that they would say is that they see themselves as having an obligation to protect their children from forces that are trying to cause harm to them, that are also causing harm to the community as a whole, and that their advocacy is part of that. They also are, Michael made this excellent point in one of his 7 points, that they have a different attitude around infection. And they, not everybody, but there is a strain of person who believes very much that naturally acquired immunity is better immunity. And so one of their sort of arguments is about the idea that letting your kid get chickenpox is a safer long-term bet than giving them the varicella vaccine because it's stronger immunity. I think that's not correct, but that's one of the ways that they sort of would justify it, which is basically like these infections, the risk of these infections has been overblown.
I think there would be a sense in which you can't ask me or our society to shut down in order to protect that small vulnerable. I mean, this is what kind of part of the argument around that happened with COVID. And I think this has been a solidifying kind of perspective among a lot of MAGA people, is that you can't, for those that are vulnerable around COVID, if we could kind of go back and kind of re-experience, those people who are vulnerable, they should shelter, they should protect themselves, but the rest of us, the vast majority of people should just be able to continue and live life. And it's not, I think there's just it's not reasonable to ask an entire society to accept something that they don't necessarily want, some people who don't want it, in order to protect the vulnerable. So you could say that's not loving, but maybe it's not. On the other hand, within an individualistic society that values the individual, the onus is on the vulnerable person to protect himself or herself. And I think that's the attitude. When I'm hearing people kind of say, well, we shouldn't have, as soon as we kind of figured out what was going on with COVID and children, we should have put children back into public schools. And the vulnerable and the elderly, they should have sheltered and remain sheltered because they're vulnerable and if they don't want to take the risk, but everyone else needs to live. And I think that would be better. That's better flourishing for all of society. That's the kind of thing I'm hearing from people. I don't know if that gets at what you're asking, but.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I kind of wonder how people square that with, I don't know, I guess Tim's not here anymore yesterday. But,
Yeah, he's here.
Oh, he's here, there. Number 2 on the list, love your neighbor as you love yourself. I mean, how do you, I understand that we are an individualistic society, but also, how people, again, how they have reconcile, and are they making that calculation even? Is that something that people are ultimately weighing in their minds, as you just did here, or is it not even necessarily a consideration? And if there's a discussion internally in these kinds of communities about like the obligations to each other versus themselves.
I think they are weighing it. I think everything that Michael said, I agree with. I also think that, again, they have this different risk calculus around natural infection, which they see as less dangerous than the way that public health describes it. And they also see the risk of vaccines as much higher than public health describes it, right? So it's protecting their own kids from the exposures to things that they think of as potentially contributing to neurodevelopmental disorders or other chronic conditions, and it's also protecting other kids.
Really great. I appreciate that Jacob is wrestling for just a little bit more, a little more sermon from from yesterday's journalist instead of the data from today's pastor. All right. So we have 6 people on the list. When we come back, let's take a true half-hour break. Okay, welcome back. First up is Miranda Kennedy from Vox. If you feel ready, otherwise we'll go to somebody else. You're always ready. Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious, especially for you, Rachel, what you hear from the MAHA movement that you think has like scientific or medical validity. Like some of the things that they talk about, like you talked about the kind of deeper concern over toxins like microplastics versus like bugs. I mean, some of that stuff has been in like the liberal progressive imagination for a long time.
Yeah.
I personally grew up with a hippie mom who was like, dirt is good for you or whatever. But I'm curious like where you see that there actually is either alignment, either with, you know, kind of liberals and progressives and or more importantly with the medical establishment.
I think a lot of their questions are really valid and actually, frankly, would be sort of non-controversial were it not for the political context. Some stuff around contaminate, like microplastics is a good example where, if anything, that would have been coded as a liberal concern, I think, for a long time until quite recently. And so the question of a bunch of their questions, why, you know, the chronic disease epidemic in children, what's causing it, where did it come from? What about the structure of our food systems? What about the way in which we grow food in this country? What about other contaminants, et cetera, et cetera? Like those questions, I think, are all really valid, pretty unobjectionable, worth investigating. I think over-medicalization of in kids is a pretty interesting and fruitful area of inquiry. You know, they have a lot of concerns about the use of psychiatric medicine off-label in kids for ADHD and other conditions, and that sort of that growing and widespread practice and what its implications are. I think worth taking seriously. The place where it sort of begins to fall apart is like they sort of MAHA leadership tries to answer those questions, I think, rather than just set a research agenda. And with those answers, they get into space where I think there's just not evidence. So like they have, maybe you remember, like Kennedy said this thing about walking through an airport and seeing glossy-eyed kids who looked like they had dysfunctional mitochondria. Do people remember him saying that a while ago? And it was like this totally sort of nutty sounding, like you can see, like, I'm walking around, I see all these kids with dysfunctional mitochondria. That like taps into an entire MAHA theory of what goes wrong with our bodies and our energy metabolism that's way over-specified from what the evidence supports. But the question several steps before that about like, what are the effects of screen time for kids, right? What about the ways in which we structure kids' days to have a lack of physical activity? What about what we feed kids? All of those things. Those are good questions, I think.
How about we stick with the back row for a minute and go to Natalie, Allison at the Washington Post.
Thank you, Josh. So I guess the title of this was Religious Currents of MAHA. But it's kind of struck me because, of course, there's always been the conservative homeschool type families who had opposed vaccines or maybe were sort of crunchy but voted Republican otherwise. But the thing about the MAHA movement to me that's sort of stood out in my head is that it brought into Trump's coalition people who are not religious in a way that, you know, they're not your typical conservative or Republican voters. And I'm just curious, like, from you guys' research and experience with MAHA, if you've encountered much tension between the religious right and these new sort of hippie, non-religious people who've suddenly found themselves in this conservative movement on the basis of vaccines and food and things like that. And if you have seen that manifest in any kind of like clashes or tension on, you know, who gets to belong in it.
I would say that I don't think the religious right and MAHA are clashing specifically, but MAHA clashes a lot with other elements of the Republican coalition. It's very anti-corporate, anti-big pharma, anti-big agriculture. Those are pretty core constituencies for the Republican Party. And like the recent glyphosate order, right? Trump did this executive order around invoking the Defense Protection Act to protect domestic manufacturers of this pesticide ingredient called glyphosate. Was like a huge betrayal of MAHA, but like obviously to serve like Midwest farmers, which is like a core Republican constituency. So there's tons of conflict with other elements. I don't actually think that there is as much conflict with the religious right, and that's partly because there's shared mistrust of the state. Even if they don't have a shared belief, like umbrella belief system exactly uniting them, they have like there's shared mistrust of the state and a real like leave me alone to do my thing and to raise my family the way I want.
Specifically on the abortion issue, have you seen that discussion come up much in these discussions of, this is my body and how those groups are not in alignment on that issue?
This is my obsession. It's the most interesting thing in the world to me, which is the way in which the medical freedom element of MAHA doesn't contend at all with its own contradictions, and the ways in which it doesn't actually include reproductive freedom. Like they've given that up. And when you ask MAHA leaders about it, they say, medical freedom is about science and abortion's a cultural issue, and that's not what we engage.
Touch that one too, Michael, or are you happy?
The religious rationales they seem to be kind of an after effect. Some of the religious people I've talked to that have these, they're saying, well, I don't know if it's a religious, I'm not here because it's a necessarily religion itself that's driving it. So it doesn't seem like it's a direct confrontation for those reasons, and it's more like it's a shared enemy. We have a common enemy, and that common enemy really builds very strong trust in alliances. So that seems to be going on. So the mothers I've interviewed, I've asked them, is religion playing a role? And they would pause and say, yes, it is. And I'll explain how. But those aren't the first impulses. Those aren't the first reasons that they're going to explain where they are. And so I think that decreases any kind of sense of conflict with those within the same movement who aren't religious.
Bill Schott, Ali from Interfaith American Magazine.
Hi. I find it fascinating that this particular panel has been so interesting to me when, I don't know about the rest of you, I don't tend to cover MAHA and scientific movements. I cover religion and other aspects. But I come to you, as I was telling some of my colleagues, because I do have a son who's autistic. He's profoundly autistic. I've spent a lot of time dabbling in some of these circles, trying to understand biomedical interventions and what other people are doing, and it's a weird, wacky, very interesting world.
Totally.
I'm also married to a doctor who's from Western medicine, so it's a very interesting confluence in our house. So we've had numerous discussions around vaccines and things like that, which all leads me to say is that there's a lot of talking at each other that I see between communities. And a lot of approach, I feel, I'm a journalist myself, and from other journalists, when you're coming to stories like these, like with maybe some preconceived notions, or maybe some like, that's just crazy, but I'm gonna talk to them, without understanding where that side, where they're coming from and what their experiences have been, like some of the quotes that you have shared, Michael. And Rachel, you are at this really interesting place of being a writer for the Times and a physician and interacting with the movement and trying to understand it. What kind of advice would you give to journalists on how to approach these stories and how to get people to open up to you and how to listen, more openly to try to understand where it's coming from, so it's not talking at each other? It's more trying to figure out what the underpinnings are.
We were just talking about this. I think we can both, talk about how we've gotten people to share their stories with us. I think it's not different than lots of other sort of areas where you approach people with respect and with a genuine curiosity rather than in an effort to catch them or to get a quote from them that affirms your priors. I will say that I have been going to sort of these MAHA gatherings over the past year, and am consistently, like, I introduce myself as, I'm a doctor from New York and I write for the New York Times, which probably is as hostile sounding a profile. And consistently people are like, good for you, sweetheart, come here, let me tell you my story. Like, people are incredibly generous actually with sharing their story in a way that I find very moving. I also think that I'm oriented to be interested in suffering. And so talk to people a lot in a way that tries to honor what they're sharing with me. And it's not that in my clinical, I didn't get to say this before, but people always are asked, in my clinical life, as I mentioned, I am interacting all the time with people who have ideas about health, and many of whom have vaccine hesitancies, specifically in my patient population. And that's like a negotiation between us that occurs in the context of our relationship. And I really, the success that I've had in getting people to potentially accept a vaccine that they were initially hesitant about has happened in contexts where I've worked really hard to build trust with that person. And I just don't approach my interactions with the public in a way in which I am asking of them to trust me initially with anything, or where I'm giving them advice, or telling them things about their experience. I also just do feel incredibly, unbelievably humbled by talking to parents of kids with severe disabilities, and sort of very aware that I have nothing to tell them about their experience. Like, it's for them to tell me. I don't know.
At least in the conversation the last day and a half, there's this, everything immediately goes to politics and law. I mean, I know that those are the panel discussions or whatever, but most of the media and news kind of does that. And it immediately polarizes. And for me, I mean, I try not to, I read the newspaper a little bit every day. I try not to read too much because it's depressing. And most of life is really, there's a lot of good things going on in the world. And we don't hear much about it, even though it's right in front of us. And I wonder whether there are ways to, maybe it's just not, it's not sexy enough. It doesn't sell papers. It doesn't get clicks. But I heard Ashley say yesterday, it doesn't create conversions. Like, conversions? Oh my gosh, that's totally religious language. It's conversions.
That's our key metric too.
Yeah. And we try not to have that as a metric, actually. So, but are there ways of telling? And this is kind of a question back to you all as journalists. Are there ways of engaging these issues that doesn't play into the framework of polarization in politics? Can you tell these stories in any way that sidesteps that, and stories of connection and of people crossing the aisle and celebrating those sorts of things? And I think they're happening, but a lot of people are very hesitant to. And I'll just give one example at the Harvard School of Public Health. I know a number of professors who have refused to meet with JFK Jr. Of course, the government and Harvard aren't doing so well these days, but they've refused to meet with, he is the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I mean, it's probably not a bad thing to at least meet and talk, but they're refusing to do it because they don't want to legitimize who he is and what he's saying, because it's from their perspective, it's completely bogus science. It's bogus public health. But that kind of attitude and kind of what's going on, it really is. It's only furthering the divide. And I wonder, are there ways that you as journalists can try to start telling other stories that are taking place that bring people together?
How about Jack Jenkins on that same side of the aisle?
Sure.
Religion News Service.
Okay. to both of y'all, I take your point that MAHA draws from several populations that predated the Trump era entirely. And I'm just kind of struck by your encounter with incarcerated folks who are like, why is the government paying me to put something in my body? That pairs with what we've seen in South Carolina, where one of the largely unvaccinated communities that has been hardest hit by the measles outbreak there are folks who used to live under Soviet Russian rule and have deep skepticism of government. But I also note that in terms of the MAHA movement's like political import, that was this shift that seems to have occurred in the aftermath of COVID. I did a lot of coverage of how, particularly vaccine skepticism and opposition to COVID-19 mandates and how those impacted houses of worship, brought in a lot of religious actors and religious political actors. People were traveling the country, speaking at different events, and certain churches, certain conservative and sometimes right-wing churches grew specifically because they refused vaccine mandates. And then if they didn't necessarily promote vaccine skepticism, they didn't do much to dilute that sentiment within their congregations. And that was picked up by political actors as well, everything from Turning Point USA to major politicians. At these rallies that I was at, pastors were encouraging people to run for local office to get rid of school mandates for vaccines, things like that. So I give that one for the context for why some journalists might cover the political angle, is because it was clearly happening. We didn't create the political piece of it. But I'm curious from the religious perspective that the unifying thing there seems to be this deep distrust of government, the deep distrust of the authority. And I'm curious what you make of that COVID-19 moment of, given what Tim was saying yesterday, particularly among white evangelicals, but not exclusively there, communities that were already predisposed to have internal narratives about distrust of government, concerns about oppression, that, this gave this pivot point to really just dig in to this MAHA movement that has led to the reduction of MMR vaccines and a rise in religious and non-medical exemptions from vaccines. I'm just curious about how that overriding narrative kind of sat on top of these communities and pulled them into a political coalition from your perspective.
I mean, your question is answering your own question. I mean, those are the sorts of energies that have been taking place. There's a deep distrust. The distrust was already there within, among a lot of religious conservatives. They don't trust government. Government should be small. Government is the beast that is going to be used to where the Antichrist is going to come and use that entity to kill and destroy. And so we want to keep the government as small as possible, and we certainly don't want the government putting stuff into our bodies against our will. So I mean I'm putting it very crudely. It normally wouldn't be said quite so crudely, but that's the underlying kind of sense or belief. And then they see it happen right in front of their eyes, and they close down our houses of worship while allowing other organizations to stay open. And it becomes very clear that this is what's happening. And I think I was talking to someone a few weeks ago. He's a religious conservative, and he believed that government officials were testing the churches. I'm testing the churches to see how far they could go into coercion, and in order to see if these very powerful governments can control people. And I think a lot of the suspicions grew, and now people, the church, a lot of churches we're not going to let this happen again. We now know, and we see how we're willing to cave in, and we will not do that again. But it is that there is a theological kind of religious, biblical kind of rationale within the evangelical church that is very hypersensitive.
And I think just to echo that, in other religious contexts also, so in New York City, there was unbelievable tension between, New York, obviously the epicenter of the pandemic in the country, the place where we, there were other parts of the country that were sort of waiting for what was happening in New York to come to them. It never happened. And then that sort of that the way in which that tension was never met with consequence actually ended up feeling, I think, to people as though they had been misled in some ways, right? In New York, that wasn't true. In New York, there were ambulances 24/7, and there were overcrowded emergency rooms, and there were 30,000 deaths in a matter of months. And even still, there was lots of tension, especially between Orthodox Jewish communities in the state around the closure of centers of worship and people, going and using bolt cutters to take locks off the door in order to be able to worship together, and then having the cops show up and breaking up religious ceremonies, really sort of wild showdowns that validated the mistrust that was already there between that community and the state. That community already exists at a state of being leave us alone to manage our own business. And so that it was just all heightened in those dynamics. The other thing I'll just say about that is in April or May of 2020, when New York was in the throes of the pandemic, the Department of Health, the pandemic experience that most public health officials in the US could remember was HIV, right? The recent experience that informed the generation of people who were in charge of this experience was HIV. And there were lots of lessons that came out of that about how to help people, about harm reduction, right? About how to sort of help people make safer choices, knowing that you're not going to be able to get them to completely give up everything that they want to do. But it also dictated which behaviors people sort of understood to be necessary, and it revealed lots of biases about what liberal technocratic governments think about. So the New York City Public Health Department put out guidance for people who were meeting each other for sex during the pandemic, for group sex, for here's how you can do that safely and reduce your risk in this context. It's a really great document. It's very funny. It's I can't quote it in this context, but you can look it up. But there was official Department of Health guidance about group sex, and there were locks on the doors of houses of worship. And that's a very stark distinction about what the government sort of thought of as being necessary to people's well-being, spiritual well-being, emotional, social well-being.
How about to Megan Sashkavelli?
So I've been thinking a lot about, I couldn't find it to quote from exactly, but I remember there was some interview with a former CDC official who had said something to the effect of, we have all of these recently arrived immigrants to the US are very grateful to have access, sometimes for the first time, to all these childhood vaccines, whereas a lot of what she was describing as white, affluent, highly educated parents are pushing back on doctors and becoming vaccine hesitant. And I've tried to look at some data on the demographics of vaccine skeptics, and it seems really mixed and unsettled. What is this population? And I'm just wondering if you could give any insights about the education level of people in the MAHA movement and people and parents who are vaccine skeptics. And what does it really look like? Because I feel there's a narrative that it's lower educated people, but I'm not sure if that's really true.
It's not true in my experience in talking to, so again, I think who we sort of think of as being the MAHA movement, I think really describes what are mostly middle class or affluent, mostly white, and mostly college educated families. Although I don't have the statistics to quote that, but I don't think that that's wrong. But what I would say is that the broader phenomena of mistrust towards public health, mistrust towards healthcare, vaccine hesitancy, et cetera, is much broader than that demographic. And amongst new immigrants, I think the thing that I would say is that that's true for some people, depending on the countries that they're coming from, and less true for other people. And as Jack just said, there is this amazing phenomenon in South Carolina where a lot of the people who are unvaccinated came from Eastern Bloc countries where they had there had been compulsory vaccination under communism, and they don't trust the state to put things in their bodies. And in West Texas, that Mennonite community is, a huge proportion of it, despite the fact that they are mostly white, are undocumented folks who move between Mennonite communities in the US, Mexico, and Canada. And part of their vaccine hesitancy is that they are undocumented and they don't seek engagement with the state that they don't have to have. And they are, and so some of the vaccine hesitancy is not quite secondary to that, but certainly adjacent to it.
Just a person to look for is Joshua Williams. He's a physician in Denver, has done research and published multiple studies. You can find him on PubMed. And I don't believe education plays into a role as far as vaccine attitudes. And then just kind of personally, I've talked to a lot of really smart people who are convinced that who are hesitant around vaccines. So at least on a personal kind of anecdotal level, I'm not seeing that at all. It is the narrative that it's the, well, I won't say it, but the less educated who are holding these views, and I don't think that's actually the case. So.
Great, complicates the narrative, and all those Gallup stats you shared at the beginning were pretty helpful too. Sabrina Rodriguez from Wall Street Journal.
Thank you both so much. This has been like endlessly interesting. I feel like I've learned so much in the span of a couple hours. I'm curious, I mean, you kind of both have hit at, like, one of, as a politics reporter, I personally have my own frustrations with political reporting and how so much of it is framed on like electoral outcomes, or is framed around Trump, or is framed around RFK, because that will drive a lot of interest, or is sort of like the sexy subject. I'm curious though, as we've had this broader conversation about, mistrust, distrust in institutions, when it comes to reporting on this, what are some of like the biggest misconceptions or like flawed narratives you're seeing in the coverage around MAHA? And like, what are storylines that you feel like are so ripe to be covered that you're just not seeing happen around this movement, since so much is like driven by Trump and RFK?
I wanted to share like one critique, kind of with all the love in the world for The Atlantic magazine. But Ashley and I discussed this last night. But there was this like incredibly egregious example, I think, of bad reporting, of sort of bad media around this recently that I think helps highlight where the good media could be, which is a few weeks ago, The Atlantic published a piece that had that by the writer Liz Brunig, who's a really beautiful writer. It was an incredibly powerful essay written in the second person, and the subhead on the piece was "When Your Family Becomes a Data Point in a Measles Outbreak." And it told the story of a family that sounded like it could be the reporter's family, very intimate, told from very intimate perspective about a mother with two kids who, sort of fits the stereotypical projection of who an anti-Vaxxer MAHA mom is. Those kids end up getting measles at a birthday party, and then it tells this sort of horror story in which one of the children dies in sort of one of the most painful ways that you can die from measles, which is a very late stage complication where the kid recovers, but then 8 years later has this devastating neurologic complication and dies. Horrible. It was entirely fictional. It was not based on interviews with families that had kids die of measles. It wasn't based on any of the interviews with any of those families in South Carolina who currently were, dealing with measles in their homes. It was based on interviews with physicians about what measles can do to the body. It wasn't grounded in the experience of what people are actually doing right now. And it was a totally simplified narrative, frankly, about who this is happening to, and sort of it was like liberal horror porn. It was like the most horrific projection of a very, very rare complication. Measles is bad disease. This thing can happen, but it was really offering a story about measles that flattered a lot of the assumptions that drive sort of liberal politics and perspectives on this. I share that because I think it did real damage to, one, I think it's just really important not to make stuff up. like generally, but especially here, where mistrust is the seed of it all. I think it's extremely important not to make stuff up. I think there is this real perception in the MAHA movement that we fetishize the consequences of these infections in ways that we do not. Other causes of childhood deaths, this country tolerates thousands of deaths from gun violence a year. There are lots of other ways that we are putting our children at risk all the time with our policies. And the MAHA movement thinks that we are really sort of obsessed with this particular narrative. So telling the truth and really looking for the complexity in that truth, I think is super, super important. I think trying to get the stories of like, I am obsessed with what the deal is with those, ex-Soviet nation families in South Carolina is like, that's really fascinating to me. What has it been like for that community to go through this? And how does it change their perspective, if at all? And so just more on the ground reporting rather than punditry from afar, I think is super, super important now. And I also think really thinking about the interaction that these families that have had various traumas related to healthcare interactions, like what are those stories and what do they reveal about healthcare as it currently is? And can you sort of break out of the frame of MAHA versus the establishment and think about other ways in which there are critiques there and analysis there that could be delivered? I think that's really important.
And I would only add firsthand accounts. I think that Ashley's question was, at the beginning was, how do you make sense of the science? And then that's the story. I mean, to me, that's the kind of story that I would want to read about, like how do we make sense of these encounters, of what these mothers and parents are experiencing, and engaging scientists over, okay, help me understand what's really happening, and going beyond some of the more simplistic kind of explanations of how that's possible. I think, my hunch is that we don't really understand, and if you you start to dig deeper, scientists are going to admit that we don't understand everything, and helping kind of highlight what don't we really understand, and what's not based on kind of empirical science, but based on our best guessing, and kind of forcing kind of a highlight around that. And I would also say that I think there's been a little bit of this, but my opinion is that the academic public health community has not owned the mistakes it's made around COVID. And I think that's a big story. That's still, it's just there, and they're ignoring. It's kind of been largely ignored and maybe even kind of forgotten. And I think that plays into the whole kind of structure around distrust. And there's no real ownership of the significant mistakes that have been made, the harm that was caused, and there's a lack of kind of recognition around that. I'd be interested in hearing those kinds of stories, and I believe more on things would go a long way if public health people would actually start to say, we made a mistake, we were wrong, we jumped to certain conclusions, we made things far too certain, they weren't as certain as we were presenting them, and so on. I think it would be really helpful for people. Of course, they don't want to do that because they're just going to further erode trust. But I think if we're going to actually build trust back as a society, those are the sorts of things that people actually need to do. But it's not happening as far as I can see.
Interesting though that the pushback on that 1919 or 1918 to 1920 flu, people say nobody ever talked about afterwards. Go ahead.
I actually had one other quick question. I'm curious, I'm blanking on the name of the organization, but there's an organization in DC that has recruited several dozen public health officials or former public health officials and medical professionals to run for office. I'm curious your thoughts on sort of seeing people kind of turn to running for office as their sort of way of trying to rebuild some level of trust.
Yeah, like Amy Acton might win, right? I mean, I don't think it's a particularly good way to build trust. I don't think again, I don't think it's good to sort of equate a certain public health perspective with the Democratic Party. I think that's like counterproductive for trust building in general. I don't think it's a bad thing for people with public health perspective to be elected decision makers, you know, but I don't think of it as being, it's like a little gimmicky to me as like a solution for any of the problems we've discussed this morning.
Ryan Struck, CNN.
Rachel, I'm kind of obsessed with you calling the MAHA movement like a new Reformation. And I think there is something like very Protestant about being like, don't tell me what the studies say. Like, I'm going to read them and decide what they say for myself. So I'm interested in, you called it like the collapse of a unitary authority,
Yeah.
and whether you see that as a good thing or a bad thing, and what you think the best kind of thing that could emerge from the ashes of that is. And then, Michael, I was interested in your kind of laying out these two, like, kind of theological philosophies around vaccines, like one being, you know, God gave us rationality and science, and vaccines are a good gift from God, and these kind of alternative 7 ideas that you laid out, and how you kind of see those different views of integrating faith and science kind of as philosophical differences, and whether you see those like mapping onto a larger split in Christianity or religion in the United States.
Reformation in the Church of Science is the title of an incredible essay by a guy named Daniel Sarowitz in the magazine The New Atlantis, which is a really thoughtful journal about science and ideas, from 2022. It's really provocative and I think worth reading. So, like, I don't deserve credit for that insight alone. I think, and the other thing I would just say is that I think MAHA is part of a new Reformation, but I think I think if you think about the internet as a printing press analog, right, like a total revolution in the way that we both share information and also generate knowledge, that unitary authority of sort of the expert who says this is what's true and I'm going to pass it down wasn't sustainable, and I don't think Kennedy did that. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that was growing for decades before this, and Kennedy embodies it and also channels it towards his own ends. And I think that it's destabilizing, but potentially good. There's lots, I think, about the sort of era of what we'll call the era of expertise, when everything, you know, was the only things that mattered were those things that could be measured, and the expert was afforded discretion over all sorts of values-laden policy questions that they didn't necessarily have particular qualification to adjudicate. Like, I'm good with that being over. A provocative thing that I think about a lot is I think doctors are given too much, afforded sort of too much moral authority a lot in these debates. I think that we're afforded too much moral authority to sort of try to adjudicate what are basically democracy problems, you know? So as an example, there is all of this. Gender-affirming care for transgender children, one of like the most sort of hot button cultural issues we have. It gets adjudicated a lot, including before the Supreme Court, as a question about evidence, right? Like, do we have the evidence to support that this thing saves lives, or is that evidence insufficient? It is a much richer, it's a much richer sort of set of questions than that alone. And even if you had the evidence even if we had airtight evidence that those interventions, you know, prevented depression in kids or prevented suicidality or whatever, it doesn't necessarily then imply that those things should 100% be legal, right? But we sort of, there are a bunch of assumptions in sort of all of the ways in which we handle the body politics questions that conflate questions of fact and questions of value. And we have afforded scientists a lot of dominion over the moral aspects without actually naming that, and I'm good with taking it away from them.
There's a long history of conflict between religion and medicine. You know, and where there's been confusion within religious communities about how to interpret disease, different kinds of therapies, and it requires a lot of internal debate. So this is kind of not dissimilar from prior moments, through hundreds of years of religious communities engaging questions. Simple one is in 1846 the invention of ether anesthesia at Massachusetts General Hospital, and the questions around whether this was something that was transgressing Scripture, in which women who were bearing children, this is part of the curse that they should bear the pain of having children, and whether it was transgressing Scripture by giving anesthesia to reduce the pain. And that was a debate. That was an honest debate going on. And so there's like tons of examples like that. And as Christians argued over like what's right, we have a practice in which Christians accepted anesthesia, and is it appropriate to use this as a way to as a remedy to the curse. And it's a blessing of redemption that's been given. But it took time for religious communities to work out a theological interpretation that was believed was good and fitting and consistent. And I think that's, these theological reasons, the 7 that I gave, there are various weights and strengths. Would have to kind of it would take a little bit too much time to go through it. But I do like the forcing, coercively using, and requiring people of religion to go against their religiously informed conscience. I believe that's a real problem. And it's creating, for states that don't have religious exemptions, I kind of alluded to this earlier, that's also a real problem, and it's counterproductive to good public health. So I think that's one of the reasons that I think is quite legitimate. It's creating bitterness and a counter forces of resistance, and that should be. I've talked to other Christians who are in public health, and they tend to agree with that it's been a mistake not to have the religious conscious exemptions. So there is a theology of health. I think there's probably a theology of vaccines, and it will require time and debate around each one of these, which has already taken place. But I think, given the moment that we're in, there needs to be more conversation, more debate, and I think probably the only thing that's going to solve it is when we have a significant outbreak over measles or something else. And then people will remember why we have these vaccines and that they are really gifts of God, and we should accept them. So I think vaccines are in some ways a victim of their own success. People have forgotten what the diseases are, the harms that the diseases cause, and unfortunately, human nature is it will require a lot of pain and suffering before people then realize, no, this is a really good therapy, and we want to protect people. But most religious communities within the Christian tradition, they've already kind of made these determinations about vaccines. So it's all in the books. It's all there. It's just within practice, it gets forgotten, and it's probably going to require some kind of significant pain to remember the wisdom that's already there.
That's a nice point that has come up in the context of pluralism a lot, that the best way to get to real healthy pluralism is to draw on the latent insights that are present in the stories, in the deepest religious texts and religious stories. That's the way. It's better than a lot of other tricks, perhaps. But okay, Haley Fuchs from Politico.
Yeah, Michael, you mentioned a story about a young doctor who was deeply frustrated with patients who wouldn't take the vaccines. The physicians that I know feel like skepticism of their life's work is a deep affront to kind of who they are and their identity. How is medical teaching changing at all, as we're seeing this movement, and how can it change to kind of accommodate that deeply personal thing that physicians feel?
I think that the skepticism is a huge burden for physicians because of the way in which it changes the dynamic of clinical encounters, and it prevents people from being able to create bonds with patients that they would otherwise like to create in order to be helpful to them. I'm less sympathetic to, like, it's an affront to my life's work. Like, also, like, just like the average doctor didn't invent the vaccine. You know what I mean? Like, it's received wisdom for us too. Like, it's fine. It's like their body, not your body. It's their body, not your body is like a really hard lesson for doctors to learn. Doctors are very bad at remembering that the thing that you are doing in the room is not happening for medicine, it's happening for the person, and that they're going to have to live in that body. I think palliative care in general, which is a relatively new field, right, which sort of became entrenched in medical training after I went to medical school, even, like in the sort of late aughts, early teens is when I think it became sort of standard curriculum. Palliative care really is premised on this idea that it's their body, it's not your body. They get to decide the goals. They get to decide what they value. They can make choices that to you feel irrational if it suits their goals. And that's very, very important. And I think trying to sort of adapt that ethos into other fields is one of the ways in which you help people get through these encounters in a way that feels productive instead of brittle.
And there's something called, it's been called the hidden curriculum. So there's the actual teaching that might take place, and then there's what actually goes on the wards, in the day-to-day. And for this particular young physician who's in my church, she's working 80 or more, really more than 80 hours a week. And the stress of just trying to get through day to day, seeing a lot of real suffering. Sometimes, for the younger physicians, for the first time in their lives, they're really seeing pain and suffering and she's, working at a children's hospital and seeing it among the very young and vulnerable. So it's a lot to process, and then you're super busy and you're running from place to place, and then you're dealing with someone who's got big questions about something you think is really basic, and you don't have time, you don't have the energy, you didn't sleep at all last night, so you're dealing with all of those sorts of things, and the only kind of education is time, and learning through the mistakes, and then having time to process a lot of things that you're seeing in order to kind of go back and say, okay, I need to do this when this comes up, and that's the good physicians. That's what they learn. They learn from their mistakes and they get better at it over time. But it's through practice and through the real experience.
Can we take 2 questions, and then we'll have a closing pair of comments, and then we'll wrap? So John Purvis and Jacob Rabushkin. I trust, Jacob, you're up. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll keep it quick. Rachel, I was interested that you raised the example of Orthodox Jewish communities in New York, who sort of many of whom strongly resisted the vaccine and other kind of COVID sort of public health restrictions. And I was wondering, through that lens, is there any evidence, to the extent that MAHA is an organized movement, of kind of interfaith collaboration to sort of push back on vaccine mandates or any kind of restrictions on freedom of worship? Or is this kind of happening independently, but sort of aligned on sort of the sort of pushback against sort of public health or sort of public health mandates?
It's a great question. I don't know of interfaith organizing specifically around these issues, and and in general, when you go to, for example, a Children's Health Defense meeting where there is lots of sort of referencing God, that is not an interfaith group. That is a group that is referencing a Christian God. There is, I think Kennedy, et cetera, are savvy enough that they recognize that this dissatisfaction is across groups, and they are sort of sympathetic and they sort of seek opportunities, I think, to deliver for or to speak in the language of or to go out and meet leaders of communities that feel like they are otherwise, that they were ignored by the state or mistreated.
I want to ask specifically about Kennedy. It seems that between his own story of essentially personal revelation, going from being a guy who was snorting cocaine off of toilet seats to the man he is now, and his constant reference back to his own lineage, and his connection to this almost mythical family of American politics, there's a vaguely messianic, or at the very least prophetic, valence to this whole thing. What does that mean for the future of the movement? Where does all of that go? And especially looking at Kennedy as the flawed and political person he is, in addition to this person who has assumed a prophetic mantle, what is the potential downside risk for him and for the movement as it continues to grow and evolve within the larger sphere of American politics?
Yeah, when Kennedy speaks about how he ended up in the cabinet, he says it was providential. He describes, his line is, "I prayed every morning for 13 years for God to put me in a position to save the health of America's children," and that's what's happened. There's like a very explicit, not subtext, sort of manifest destiny, religious prophecy, sort of overlay to his whole thing. And I also do think that you're totally right. It's related to his personal quest and sort of arc as someone who overcame addiction, and didn't just overcome addiction, but overcame addiction through AA, which is a very spiritual way of connecting to your story about your demons and overcoming them and aspiring to be good and having a relationship with God. He goes to an AA meeting every single day still. So, his arc, I think he really sees himself as this like hero with this religious, element to it. It's the question, though, about what the relationship is between him and his centrality to the movement, and then also like if he kind of fizzles or goes nowhere or implodes in the millions of ways he might implode because he's a very sloppy guy. Like what happens to the rest of this? It's a really open question. MAHA, the term, right, like didn't exist until August of 2024 when he dropped out of the presidential, aligned with Trump, and then rebranded the movement behind him as MAHA to align with MAGA, right? Like it's a coalition that's relatively recently formed as a political force. Whether that coalition sticks together, whether it has political juice, whether there's a meaningful block of voters there who can actually swing elections the way that they claim, I don't think any of that is very clear at all. At the same time, I think he has, I've said this to several people here the last 2 days, I think he's running in 28. I think that's his intention, is to run in 28. And so, there's certainly designs amongst the MAHA leadership to grow it, to grow the influence, and to in some ways sort of be the MAGA 2.0, like a new anti-establishment force that comes in and takes over the Republican Party.
And I'm so glad that John Purvis asked that question about the Orthodox Jewish community, because one of my good friends in New York is an Orthodox rabbi of this congregation that's been around, I think, longer than any other synagogue in the United States. He says, a little fact that we remind ourselves about only once a day. And he likes that, rather. And he says that we have a definition in our synagogue for what a secret is. And do you know what a secret is? It's something that you can only tell one person at a time. That's great. So maybe there's some secret about Bobby Kennedy, and you may have heard it just now. Who knows? All right. Thank you so much, Rachel and Michael. That was great.
Thank you.